Social and Cultural Changes, Chapter 11. I've noticed that the last couple of lectures have been rather lengthy, so I thought I would try it this way, and I would like for you all to let me know if you like it better having a short lecture on each chapter instead of having one long lecture with both of them together. So we'll try this one time and see how it goes. Early in Kentucky, I mean way early, like the 1700s, even up into almost the 20th century, as a matter of fact, women were considered chattel. They could not make their own wills. They could not own property. They could not vote. They could not work unless their husband gave them permission. And they were bound to a male, either to their father when they were a child, if their father died and they weren't married, to their older brother, and then to their husband. And if by chance their father died and left them some land, it was theirs until they married. But upon marriage, everything that a woman owned, including the clothes on her back, became her husband's. If they should happen to get a divorce, which she couldn't do, but he could, the children were automatically awarded to the husband because she was a woman. And if you look at the headstones, they're always known as someone's beloved wife, beloved sister, beloved daughter. And you very rarely ever see anyone with the first name. That's why I really hope you enjoyed that page 147 where it's telling you the names of some people. I mean, Mary Draper Ingalls and Virginia Sally Wiley. The only reason we really know them is because they supposedly, and I say supposedly, wrote the story of their capture by Indians. In reality, they told their story to someone else, and it was put in story form. You read about Jane Todd Crawford, who rode 64 miles on horseback to have a surgery. You read about Delilah Ann Webster, who was an abolitionist. And Hannah Dunn, of course, is my favorite one that's mentioned. Being a big woman, she chopped wood, she was a bartender, she was a bouncer, she could hunt bar. She was quite the lady. Of course, Catherine Spaulding, known for opening an academy, but for the most part, women, they were just unknown. We were a necessity. And the strange thing is we had little or no education because it doesn't take any education to birth a baby. You don't need education to can and work in the yard and slop the pigs and feed the chickens. You might have a better beneficial father who says you need to learn how to read enough to read the Bible. Now that would be a good thing. But too much reading might get your head all screwed up. So we had little or no education, and it just wasn't necessary. And the strange thing is Kentucky women seem to have little or no interest in furthering women's rights. And a lot of it was because we didn't know what was going on. The man sat on the woman so heavily that we may have a leader from back east come into Kentucky to talk about women's rights, but we wouldn't know about it. Our husband wouldn't let us be told about it. And if we were told, we would not be allowed to go to the meeting. But there was a very big disparity between the lifestyle of the rich and the lifestyle of the poor. The rich woman, the pampered daughter, perhaps, of a wealthy family, she might be able to go to school and learn how to read and write, and she might even go to what we call a finishing school. And this school wasn't to teach her how to keep a set of books or how to take dictation. This was to teach her how to be a better lady. She might learn to read and speak French. She might learn how to play the piano, ride a horse side saddle. She would learn all the graces that would needed to be a wife of a successful man and to entertain. And as I said, she could read and write, so she would keep a diary. So we know the lifestyle of the rich, but not only Kentucky, but the rest of the South. But the poor, living out from a town, perhaps. She didn't know how to read or write, or she didn't know how to do any reading at all. It was just a few words from the Bible. Like I said, she's raising children. She's working with her husband in the field. She's taking care of the garden. She's slopping the pigs. She's gathering the eggs. She's working in the garden. She's cooking and she's canning. She's making clothes. She's washing clothes. She doesn't have time to sit down and write what her life is like. The lifestyle is entirely different, but the one thing that they both do have in common is children die young. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you lose a child, it hurts. But also they're bound to the male, because rich or poor, you're under the man's thumb. You have no rights. You are chattel. But what about public education for the male of the species? Well, don't you love that term, blab schools? Uh, I just find it so interesting. And basically, what it means is there weren't any books. You learned by rote memorization. And of course, the earliest educators were male and they were ministers. So a lot of it was focused on learning how to read and write the classics as well as the Bible. Because men and educators and legislatures, there's no need for education. If you are wealthy and you want to learn to become a doctor or a lawyer or something, you would, of course, study under someone who was a successful doctor or lawyer, but you could go away to school to William and Mary or someplace else. Besides which, if we tried to educate the people of Kentucky, it would cost so much, and nobody wanted to tax. It was a luxury that we really didn't need. I mean, how much reading and writing do you need to know how to figure out how much you're going to charge for a load of wood or selling a pig or something? You don't need to read and write. Just the rudiments. But there was many studies done, but they couldn't seem to get through their head that they might have better citizens if the citizens knew what was going on. In other words, if they could read and write. And there was study after study done, but nothing was accomplished. In 1831, of 140 plus students that were interviewed, if you would, only 31,000 of those 140,000 actually were going to school, and this was in large cities like Louisville and Lexington. But we still think maybe something ought to be done about it because the other states have got public education, public supported education. So in 1838, we instituted a board of education. Now, didn't you find reading that segment on county commissioners very interesting, to put it mildly? They not only set the criteria for it, but hired and fired the teachers. They set their salaries. They set the rules for what you were going to study. And half the time, the county commissioners couldn't even read or write. So remember I told you in last lesson we had to remember Governor Oldsley, mainly because in 1847 he appoints a Reverend Robert J. Breckinridge as superintendent of public education. Now, in all honesty, folks, if it wasn't for the Breckinridges and Clays, our state would probably still be behind the ball because they have done so much to help our state. Now, he is a great-grandson, not the great-grandson, but a grandson of our John Breckinridge from the 1700s. In 1847, when he became the superintendent of public education, 20,000 plus students were going to school. And like I say, these are in the large cities. I see there's been a decrease from 32 to 47, too. But by the time he left, 6 years later, over 200,000 plus students in Kentucky were attending school. He managed to get laws passed and regulations changed so there was money for education. And then, of course, that in 1850, we had a constitutional change where finally, for the first time after 60 some odd years, the state is going to help support education. And we're making continual progress. It looks like we're coming along up until the Civil War. And, of course, the Civil War brought a lot of things to a screeching halt. I just thought this was interesting. You think of schools in Kentucky, but there was a business school formed in 1799. In 1822, we had the Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb to teach them how to read and write. In 1824, we actually had a mental hospital. We were no longer chaining these people to their beds and charging money for people to come in and watch them have fits. In 1825, we actually had a school for Choctaw Indians. And throughout all this, Kentucky never did have a law outlawing the teaching of slaves, but believe me, it was frowned upon. The last thing you want to do is have this black man learn how to read and write. He might find out something about, like, the Exodus. He might learn that there's something in the Bible other than servants obey your master. In higher education, we did a lot better. Of course, in 1799, a little school called Transylvania College was established. It combined two existing schools, Kentucky Academy and a Presbyterian school, and it became known throughout the United States for this medical school part. We were training physicians right and left. And the school, one of them that combined, the former Kentucky Academy, just for a bit of information, later became the Center College, which is we still have around. And I thought this was a rather interesting picture, although it wasn't taken in 1799, of course. It's a pretty prestigious school, even today. So the University of Louisville, the Logan Female College, Bethel Female College, Brera College, all these colleges are starting in Kentucky. We're much better at higher education than we are at lower education. But if you'll notice, most of them seem to be located around Louisville and Lexington. Of course, Brera College isn't. And it had some problems because it was so anti-slavery, it actually let black people come to school. That was going to cause a lot of problems later on. And the University of Kentucky was founded in 1837, but it moved locations and changed names several times. But so it didn't become known as the University of Kentucky actually until 1916. So what about religion? Well, the first church service was in 1775 in Boonesboro. Now you've got to realize that people did not come to Kentucky for religious purposes. They didn't always come just to escape the king's laws. They came looking for land and a way to make a better life. And when they get out here and they find that it's beautiful land, and there's a lot of land out here, but as we've discovered, there's a lot of steps to take to get the land, and the Indians are just not too pleased to have us here. So you're busy chopping down trees, and you're clearing your land, and you're working trying to make some furniture for your wife, and you're hunting Indians or getting involved in one of these wars, or Indian wars, or French and Indian War or something. Actually, going to church is the last thing you're thinking about, because there weren't any churches except in the big cities. You were doing good if you saw a traveling minister once every 2 or 3 months. And in the beginning, of course, the Anglican Church was a casualty. And the Anglican Church is nothing more than the Church of England. It went the wayside pretty quick. It was kind of a hoity-toity place. The Episcopal or the Presbyterians were the ones that seemed to be hanging on the most, and they're the ones who came to this area the first organized religion. But the Baptists would become the largest denomination out here. And we have record of Squire Boone teaching the first sermon in Louisville and performing the first marriage. But the Baptists, they have a lot of no-nos. Even today, no drinking, no swearing, no dancing, no fornication, no adultery, no fighting. They're very rigid, believe in the exact wording of the Bible. The Methodists come in 1780s. The Presbyterians were already here, but they started growing in 1783. And by 1792, when we became a state, we actually had some Catholics out here. And then we had Jewish synagogue in 1850. And of course, that United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, also known as the Shakers. And of course, the Shakers didn't believe in any kind of personal relationships. They believed in growing their group by recruitment. So I guess you'd say by the early 1800s, we have all different types of religions out here, but the Baptists will remain the biggest. Now, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church is different than the Presbyterian Church because, as you learned since you've read your text about the revivals that were held, they were having Methodist ministers and Baptist ministers and Presbyterian ministers, and they were doing all the things that the Presbyterian Church did not like, because the Presbyterian Church used an awful lot of the Anglican Church's rules. So the Cumberland Presbyterian Church split off from the regular Presbyterian Church. But James McGarry, 1796, he's a little concerned about, well, the church attendance is down, so he starts preaching hellfire and brimstone, and he is requested to leave. He even had threats on his body, so he leaves the South and comes west to Kentucky. And he gets out here and he starts holding this series of revivals. Now, Kentucky in the late 1700s was known as an ungodly land. People were more interested in horse racing and cussing and swearing than they were going to church. But after 1796, they're going to talk about Kentucky as one of the most religious areas around. Because we started to hold these revivals, and then people started coming first by the dozens and then by the hundreds. And the strangest thing were happening. Like I said, they were having the Presbyterian, Mr. James McCready, and he would invite the Baptist circuit rider and the Methodist and the Baptist. All of them come together, black and white. And in the picture, of course, you see the elevated stand where the ministers are talking. But this is kind of a pen and ink drawing. In reality, there wasn't one big crowd. There would be little crowds because we didn't have microphones or megaphones. So you'd have a minister with maybe 100 around him, and a few hundred feet away there'd be another group with another minister talking. But in these revivals, we started having people have very strange behavior. They start talking in tongues, and they'd fall down and cry and kind of lose consciousness. And it was kind of scary, especially to the male onlooker. The biggest, I guess you'd say, supporters are the ones who were saved were young females. Of course, there were a lot of men saved too. And the biggest problem, now unless you're a Baptist, you're probably not familiar with this word backslider, and it means exactly what it says. You go to this revival and you have this amazing experience, and you are converted, or you are saved, and you're going to lead a nice Christian life. If you're a backslider, a few weeks down the road or a few months down the road, you start doing the same thing you were doing before. You were sliding backward into your old behavior. That's a backslider. And a lot of our young men were backsliders. And most of the young girls, they seem to hang on to it. And they would become the teachers and the leaders in their family. It even went all the way down into Tennessee. I mean, Kentucky became known as a very religious land at this point in time. But then things started backing up. And in 1811, 1812, we had a series of earthquakes. And it scared the heck out of the people in Louisville and Lexington so bad they took up a collection, got $1,000, and built a church. Well, the earthquake subsides, and a few weeks later, a few months later, there's another earthquake that collects some more money, another $1,000, and build another church. All told, there were several churches built at the behest of the earthquakes because they were sure that God was shaking the earth. It's the end of the times, and we're going to build a church and get on God's good side. Well, finally, the earthquake stopped coming around. So they took up a collection, this time not to build a church, but to build what we call an opera house. And they got $8,000 to build a place to have entertainment. But the revivals in Kentucky were known throughout the country, and there were revivals going on all over the place. It's called the Second Great Awakening. But the Cane Ridge Revival in 1801 is the best known one here in Kentucky. Well, even after the revivals kind of slide down a little bit, the churches are starting to split over this slavery issue. We begin to have the southern branches and the northern branches. And where the southern branches are preaching, servants obey your masters, they're also encouraging the blacks to come to attend church. But they really would like to have them worship separately, because during the revivals, I mean, they were bringing everybody in, young, old, white, black, slave, free black, and preaching equality. And of course, the slave loved to hear this. And in the beginning, they were encouraging them to join the churches. Well, it didn't take long before the southern whites decided that, yeah, it was a good idea for the blacks to attend churches, but we really don't want them sitting next to us, so let's make them sit in the back. And let's make them sit up in the loft. Let's make them stand outside. And then we started encouraging them to have their own churches. And the churches combined the white doctrine from the Methodist or the Presbyterian church along with the African culture. And like I said, they were encouraged to attend church because a religious slave who was reading the Bible or having the Bible read to him is easier to control. Of course, we have Kentuckians writing. They're writing their biographies, their autobiographies. They're talking about the slavery issue, Indian warfare, histories of the state. The histories of the state seem to be the biggest thing to be written about. Then, of course, there's Harriet Beecher Stowe, it's mentioned, with Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was written in 1848, I believe it was, or 49. And it was written in protest of something called the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in 1850. And your text tells you a little bit about Josiah Henson, but I want to give just a little bit more information about him. Everything in the text is true. It just doesn't go far enough. Josiah Henson belonged to a man in Maryland who was not a nice man, and he was a gambler. Now, back in these days, in the 1800s and 1700s, you might own 1,000 acres of land, and you might think you're considered rich, but the land isn't going to do you any good if you don't have someone to work it. So you can have 1,000 acres, but if you haven't got slaves to work that land, you're land poor. So your wealth is measured not so much in the land that you own, but in the number of slaves that you own. Well, every time Mr. Riley would get in trouble, it was the name of the man who owned him, he would put his slaves up for collateral. And one day he wasn't able to buy them back, and the sheriff showed up and said, "Hey, we're coming out tomorrow to repossess your slaves." So he calls his head slave, who was Josiah Henson, and Josiah Henson, I have trouble with my J's sometimes. He was what we call a good slave. There was no marks where the lash had ever touched his back. He'd never had his ears cropped. He'd never been beaten. He knew how to play the game and stay out of the white man's way, to pacify the white man. He was the overseer of Mr. Amos's African-American slaves. So he tells Josiah to take 21 slaves, or was it 24, but whatever it was about 2 dozen, and come or at that time, go west to Owensboro, Kentucky, to Mr. Riley's brother, who just happened to live out here on Thurston Dermont Road in Owensboro. Well, this is fine. He's got him out of the way. They're out of the state. The sheriff can't get him. And his brother works them out here. Finally gets word from the brother in Maryland to sell all the slaves except Josiah Henson and have him bring the money back, which your text relates he does, and how he preaches along the way and gets money, and he thinks he's buying his freedom when he gets there. And, of course, his master is not a very nice man, as I said, and no. Now, according to the text, it seems like as soon as he gets back, Josiah Henson realizes that things are not right, but Josiah Henson seemed to be a little slow to catch on to things. He got back, and even after he was told he had given up his money for nothing, he was still a slave, he wasn't free, he still didn't try to escape. But the brother out here gets to thinking that maybe they'd better do something because, well, Josiah Henson was a good, hard-working slave, and it'd probably be worth a lot of money on the market. Maybe they better sell him. So at this point, it gets interesting. He takes his son and takes Josiah Henson and puts him on the boat to send him down to Memphis to sell Josiah. Well, on the way down, the white man's son gets sick. So they get off the boat, and Josiah Henson nurses him back to health, gets on a riverboat, and brings him back to Owensboro. Well, finally, he gets through Mr. Henson's head, and they're going to sell me if I don't do something about it. So he starts rounding up money to say, and he's going to escape, which he did, and go all the way to Canada. And when he gets to Canada, it's a long trip. He runs into a bunch of Quakers who are starting a trade school for runaway slaves because there was no extradition from Canada. So if you were a slave and you could get to Canada, you were safe. So he writes his life story, and Harriet Beecher Stowe reads it. Now, she calls him to her home, and they meet and talk, and she interviews him, and he tells her what he has seen happen, what he has heard. He's never had any of these things done to him, and she bases her book on what he told her. And for years, we thought that she had visited a plantation in Kentucky, but she had visited, but that's not where she got her information. She got it from Josiah Henson. And Josiah Henson went on to become very educated, learning how to read and write, and helping run runaway slaves. He even got to meet President Lincoln during the war. And he even got to go to England, and he got to actually meet Queen Victoria. Very interesting man. So not only do we have Kentuckians writing about their life story and about the trials of slavery and Indian warfare and histories of the state, you've got Harriet Beecher Stowe writing this Uncle Tom's Cabin in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. And according to Mr. Lincoln, she was the lady who helped start the Civil War, because it was banned in the South. In the North, she was considered a hero. And if you've ever read the text, it's a very badly written book. Grammatically, it's not the best book. It was because of the subject it was so popular. We even have people writing poetry. And of course, our most famous Kentucky historical writer is Thomas D. Clark. And up until just a couple of years ago, we used his text as his History of Kentucky as a text. But I happen to like the one we've got now just a little bit better. But he passed away just a few years ago. Very interesting man. Medicine and diseases. I got a bunch of them listed there. Scarlet fever and measles, mumps, whooping cough, diphtheria, dysentery, cholera, smallpox, typhoid fever, yellow fever, venereal diseases. And we had at this point in our time, we had no vaccinations for anything. They thought illness was caused by bad blood or foreign matter in the body. And the only way you could do it is to get rid of it. You either purge, which means you're regurgitating. You're bleeding. In other words, we cut you into a vein and let the bad blood come out. Or we just sweat you to death. And it's been said that President Washington, because he was sick, they bled too much blood out of him, is why he died. They had no anesthetics. They had no knowledge of what germs were like. They were kind of operating in the dark. It was better than it had been 100 years ago, but we're still operating in the dark. And even when they amputated General George Rogers Clark's leg, I mean, they had to pour whiskey down him and let him bite on something and hold him down while they were cutting. But we are going to become a national leader in the medical education. Why? Because of the Transylvania University. It made us a national leader in medical training before the Civil War. And I think your text is something like 1,881 doctors were actually trained. They actually went to school. They didn't just study under another doctor. But because of professional and personal disagreements at the college, it went downhill in a handbasket. Now, your text mentions William King Solomon, a black man who helped Lexington in the 1700s. But I've got a little bit more information on him. He's a very unusual man. A lady called Aunt Charlotte, who was a slave, was brought to Lexington in the late 1700s, and she finally got herself free, and she inherited property from her owners after they died. So she supported herself by selling fruit and baked goods at the open market. But she had known William Solomon back in Virginia, and her story is kind of tied to his, because Mr. Solomon was what we call a vagrant. He did just enough work to get enough money to buy something to drink, and how he earned his wages was as a digger of ditches and cisterns and cellars and graves. And in the spring of 1833, because he didn't take baths, he smelled bad, and people just didn't like him at all. So he was arrested, and as a punishment, because they arrested him on vagrancy charges, so they were going to punish him. And the way they were going to punish him was they're going to sell him as a slave for 1 year. At the end of the year, he's supposed to return back to the court. Well, nobody was bidding on him. And finally, some students from the Transylvania University started bidding on him. They're going to make him a cadaver, ha ha ha. Well, Aunt Charlotte was there, and like I said, she had known Mr. Solomon back in Virginia, so she bought him for a sum total of $13. And she outbid him. And $13 was a lot of money back then. So as soon as she gets him home, she sets him free. And he promptly goes out and gets just enough money to get liquor. He staggered back to her house, where he passed out on a Thursday. Stayed passed out for 2 whole days. When he woke up on Saturday, he found out that a lot of people were dying of cholera, and a lot of other people were evacuating the city, and along with Aunt Charlotte was preparing to leave. She's packing her wagon. So she tells him to get his stuff and come on and go with her. They got to get away from town so they won't get cholera. But when he refused to go, she stayed with him. Now, people are dying right and left, and they're dying quicker than they can even be buried. As a matter of fact, the people who normally dug the graves had deserted the city. They weren't going to touch the dead bodies who died of cholera because they were afraid they'd get cholera themselves. Well, he decided he was going to do something about it, and he took up his shovel and began burying the dead for free. Whenever he found a dead body, he'd take them to the gravesite and bury them. And actually, he probably prevented the future spread of the disease. But both he and Aunt Charlotte did survive the epidemic. And when he finally returned to court a year later, the judge kind of took him by the hand and thanked him for his heroic deeds during the cholera epidemic. But he did die in the poorhouse in 1854. And he's now buried at the Lexington Cemetery. And over 50 years later, in 1908, they erected a large tombstone over his grave. It said, King Solomon of Kentucky, heroic gravedigger. As for Aunt Charlotte, we don't know what happened to Aunt Charlotte. She kind of disappeared from scene. But Kentucky is full of unusual people. Now here we've got this vagrant who decides to do something good to help stop the spread of the disease. And for no money at all, he buries these people. So what did people do for amusements? Well, it doesn't take a great stretch of the imagination to come up. I mean, log rolling, barn raisins, corn husking, square dancing, court days, anywhere you could get a group together. You young people today can't imagine what life was like without TV or iPods or things like that. You're just so used to having music going or somebody talking or being able to be in constant contact with somebody. You can't envision being alone for weeks at a time or just having your husband or wife around. Women would sometimes get together for what we call quilting bees, and they'd sit around and talk, and they'd get together and make big quilts. Men like to fight, of course. Knife throwing, horse racing, hunting, fishing. These were all manly activities. But as towns began to spread, of course, the entertainment became a little bit more upscale, more sophisticated, as they say. We began to have visiting entertainers who would come in and perform a concert, either musical or singing. We had some very high-class, out-of-the-country vocalists come in. We had dramas performed and musical groups performed, and we even began to have libraries, because it wasn't just Daniel Boone, as the text says, who liked to read. With literacy spreading a little bit more and the people in the cities having the time. Now, we're not talking about the people living out in the boondocks. We're talking about the cities, Louisville and Lexington and Bowling Green and things like this. People have the time, and the subscription libraries began to get going. But at the very earliest, of course, we had the log cabins, which are just one room. and they'd build their kitchen away from the main cabin to keep any chance of fire. In the beginning, we had the big fireplace, and you cooked, and that was your warmth and your fire stove. But as they started having a little bit more sense, and the further south you went, you didn't want to be cooking in one room, because you didn't have any windows. You get kind of warm in there. But when we finally had the cities growing, we had, and I've mentioned, 4 different styles here. We had Georgian, Federal, Gothic, Greek Revival. No, we were not covered and inundated with plantations built along this Greek Revival style with the big white columns like in Gone with the Wind. That was a rarity, which we get more into next chapter. But usually buildings were built in Kentucky with not so much architectural plan. You get together with a builder and you tell him what you needed. Well, I'm married and I don't have any kids, so I just need a 1-room cabin, or I need 2 rooms, I need someplace for the kids to sleep, and we just start building. And everything was happy, and as you needed more room, you just added a room onto it. But as far as art, portraiture, I can't even say that word. The painting of portraits was, you didn't have pictures, so you would sometimes have a small picture painted and put in a locket. And of course, it mentions 2 very famous painters, Joel Tanner Hart and John James Audubon. Well, John James Audubon is a horse of another story. Now, Mr. Audubon is not American born, of course. He was born in France. Well, actually, he wasn't born in France. He was born in Santo Domingo, in the islands, in Haiti. It seems his daddy was a French naval officer. And although he was married and had a family back in France, he also had a mistress in the islands. And he had Mr. John James by this mistress, but that his mother died. Well, about this time, you've got the Revolutionary War going on, and he gets involved with that. He helps us out, and he sends the kid back to France, where his wife raises the illegitimate son. Later, he does actually adopt him. But he was led a very pampered life. And he finally, after being raised and educated in France, we have the French Revolution, and things are not going well there. So Napoleon shows up, and Mr. Audubon's father decided to keep him from being involved in the war. He's going to ship him to America, which is what he did. He has some land here. So then he learns English over here, and he meets a young lady from a nearby plantation. And I was trying to think what her last name was. Her first name was Lucy. Drawing a blank on her last name, but it's not important. She's English, but she's only 16. And although he wanted to marry her, her daddy said no, not until James could, prove that he could support her. So over time, he manages to get in business with his father and sell some land, and talks Lucy's father into letting him marry her at the age of 18. And for a wedding gift, Lucy's father gave them $5,000. So he opens a store in Louisville. Like I said, once they get married, everything that was the wife's becomes the husband's. And he opened it with a partner, a Frenchman who spoke very little English. And here you've got this pampered, she'd been well educated. She knew how to ride, she knew how to read, she knew how to write. She'd led a pampered life. She'd never done anything herself. She'd always had servants. But when they get to Lexington, of course, she's living in a hotel and has to do everything herself. Well, Mr. Audubon likes to draw birds and hunt birds. He likes the Indian style of life. He becomes friendly with Indians. He learns how to do taxidermy. And not paying any attention to the business. It's not doing well. The man who he leaves in charge, his French partner, doesn't speak English that well, so things don't go too good. So he decides to pull up stakes and move on further downriver. And he'd heard about this little town called Red Banks, where all they wanted was the basics. They just wanted flour and sugar and maybe a few luxuries. They didn't really want anything else. So he goes to Red Banks. And poor Lucy, she's put in a 1-room cabin. And I've read some of her writings, and she would clean and scrub till her fingers bled, trying to get things clean and working well. And over time, of course, they started making money, and he would invest into sawmills and flour mills and things. And before you know it, she was able to have a nice home. They had a library of a couple of hundred books that were just unheard of in this part of Kentucky at that time. But Mr. Audubon is gone long periods of time, leaves a lot of the work to Lucy. And he's into painting portraits of young women. As a matter of fact, he took so long making a portrait of one woman that her husband started getting him to go hunting with him. Now, Mr. Audubon has been described as being an extremely good-looking man with black, dark, curly hair and big, steely blue eyes, fair complexion, erect, and gentle of speech. And of course, this was written by a woman, by the way. I'm not saying he had hanky-panky in mind, but he didn't stay home and take care of his wife as much as he should. They did have 4 children. They had 2 boys and 2 girls, and the girls both died before they were a year old. And the 2 boys would go on to, one help their mother and one drive their mother into bankruptcy. But we have an economic panic in our country, and there's a downslide of economics. And before you know it, not only is he having to sell off his land, he's having to sell off his businesses. He had to sell off the silverware that he was given as a wedding gift from her parents, sell off the home that they had built, sell everything. And Lucy actually had to get a job teaching school to support the family. But meanwhile, he's gone longer and longer. He does take one last load of goods from Red Banks, going to head down the river to sell it at St. Louis. And after 6 weeks, he's still not back yet. He gets landlocked in the winter weather. But over time, he's arrested for bankruptcy. She gets him out of jail. It's her who is supporting the family. She is the one that's doing it, because he's not. He tries to get a job teaching, but he doesn't make any money. He spends too much time out looking for birds. And he was not a naturalist, folks. He would kill the birds and then pose them before he painted them. But he was an excellent painter. We'll give him that. He was an excellent painter. Sometimes he would take a boat down the river and take a shotgun and just shoot up into the air at a flock of birds flying over to see how many he could kill. And like I said, he knew how to do taxidermy, so then he would fix them to paint. As a matter of fact, if he was alive today, he couldn't even be a member of the Audubon Society because he did kill animals. But as time goes by, they managed to come up with enough money to take his paintings and go to Europe and have the works published. And then they started making a little bit of money and come on back here. But meanwhile, she's still teaching. Even King George IV of England was a very avid fan of his and a subscriber to his works. The book of paintings he came up with was called The Birds of America, and he had a sequel, but they didn't make a lot of money. They were all published between 1827 and 1839. He even wrote a few newspaper articles. He managed to get enough money to buy an estate on the Hudson River. And in 1842, he published an edition called The Birds of America, again with 65 additional plates of birds in it. Altogether, he earned about $36,000, which is a lot of money during those days. It's not much today. He went west a little while, but he died in January the 27th, 1851. And his wife is still working. She worked until she was in her 80s, until she got blind and couldn't work, and then she returned to Louisville to live with one of her sons and her daughter-in-law. But he would kill the birds, then use wires to prop them into a natural position. And he'd stuff them and make them look like they were in flight. Like I say, his paintings, if you have never seen his paintings, are just absolutely gorgeous. It would be his wife and his sons who managed to get the Audubon Society started. And like I said, the irony is he couldn't be a member because they believe in total preservation. But his field notes and his birds gave a lot of people different understanding into the birds of Kentucky. And I'm hoping if you haven't, someday you can visit the Audubon, the park and museum over in Henderson. So not only did we have painters and John James Audubon, we had people who were sculpting, we had silversmiths. Were you surprised when you read that we actually had people who were silversmiths in Kentucky? You think of that as Boston, right? And we had people making furniture. I mean, we had some very talented people here, but most of these people were in the large cities. Yes, you had to know how to make furniture when you lived out in the boonies because you couldn't go down to Sears and buy any. But I'm going to suggest you take just a few minutes to digest what we've talked about here today in Chapter 12. Chapter 11, because the next chapter is Chapter 12, Slavery and Anti-Slavery. And that's a very important chapter. Hint, if you know what I mean.